Oops, I started SQL in React drama again. I honestly didn't mean to. I was just showing off a pattern that I thought was cool, but in order to understand this drama, we need a little bit of context. So first and foremost, let's do that. Also, make sure you stick around to the end because I'm going to discuss not only why this isn't scary, but patterns on how to do it more securely. And also, maybe, just maybe, get those separation of concerns people to shut up. Fingers crossed. Anyways, so first and foremost, context on where this drama originally happened. Adam Rakis made a tweet last year at NextConf. This picture is of Sam Selikoff presenting his talk showing some of the powers of the new model. In this example, he has a button that has a form action bound to it that inserts a value into the bookmarks. This is a really cool example for a bunch of reasons we'll get to in a bit, but it sparked just insane levels of outrage. People were pissed when they saw this. Everybody was like, oh my God, SQL injections, server-side code in your client code. Like none of this is safe. So problematic. Many of you might already know why it's fine, but if you don't, stick around. It's important to understand, and I think it'll really showcase how cool this stuff is. Because the goal here was Adam showing how cool and composable these patterns were. But anybody who's not in the know enough to understand how this works sees this, sees React code, sees SQL. It assumes that this is SQL code being controlled by the client and freaked out. Just as a random example of somebody not getting it, yo, I heard you like SQL injection, so I put SQL queries into server actions and demoed non-parameterized SQL patterns. Yeah, people were very concerned about this. I made a mistake, though. I shouldn't say a mistake, but you'll get the point in a minute. I saw this tweet from Drew Wilson, modern web dev. Next, going into React, going into Apollo, going into GraphQL, going into gRPC to hit your Postgres database means that we have to edit 20 code files, spend untold hours wrangling them all together, and the result is that you can get the one ID you need from the DB. This is not the way. I want to be super clear about something. I almost entirely agree with Drew here. The only change I would make is I would get rid of the word modern. I think we can sit here and argue all day about what is and isn't modern. But I think the stack he's describing here has been around long enough that while it's still very fresh and totally understandable and acceptable to use, the new wave, the new era has shifted. And we're realizing, yeah, having this level of separation between your things makes almost no sense. And you probably shouldn't be separating things blindly. That's why I felt like I had to respond. And this is my response. Actual modern web dev, React to Postgres. So here I have a SQL call that I await, I get the rows, and then I just map over them and render a link to each post ID with a post name. I did actually quickly mock this out. This is real code I wrote. I didn't see the database, so I haven't proven that it works, but it absolutely works. So I need to talk about all of this and also give some spicy takes around it because people are probably still very confused when they see this. The first thing we need to talk about is the keyword here, use server. What use server does here isn't make this a server component. And I've said this a bunch of times. I think I have to keep emphasizing it though, sadly enough. Use server is not for server components. Use server is for a very specific thing. It is creating a door on the back end that the front end can hit. So in this case, what use server does is it creates a post route on this endpoint that this component is being run on. And now whenever a post occurs, because the user pressed the button, even with JavaScript disabled, because this button's in a form. So when the form triggers, it posts to the server. And when it's posting to the server, that is code that runs on the server. None of the code itself is on the client. All the client gets is a URL, which is the current page URL that it's posting to with a traditional form. So nothing here is insecure in terms of where it is running. The other thing that's important to understand here is the way SQL is being called isn't just a random string template. This is a template function in JavaScript. Sorry, a tag function is the proper term. Found this quick example on Google. A tag function is when you pass a string with this formatting to a function. What it effectively does is every time you have a templated value in it, it puts a comma there and then separates that with like a string split. So this becomes an array of values that we call it with the name and age as the points that it breaks. So we have I am, comma, which is a new element, and then the next element, comma, for the next element here. And the reason this works is because the string templating is being converted in JavaScript land. The tagged template literal, there's a lot of different names for how to describe this thing, but it's taking all of the non-variable values here, splitting those, and then after that, the variables themselves are being passed. So this means it's being sanitized. It is trivial for us to write a function like this that takes the SQL statements here and then takes the variables and values being passed and just quickly sanitize them before they get passed in. It's totally safe and fine. Anybody freaking out about that just doesn't know the JavaScript pattern. Admittedly, it's a new enough pattern that people probably haven't seen enough that I could see why they would freak out. They're just seeing a string literal here and assuming that it's not sanitizing, but that is sanitized. So the two things people were freaking out about, which are the fact that this function runs on the client, doesn't do that. That's what useServer does. It means this is getting bound on the server and can be hit via post. And the await call here is totally fine too, because that string is indeed sanitized. So this is fine. As a button for doing bookmarks, there's nothing wrong here. There is something really, really magical here, is the fact that slug is being passed. Normally, if we were to make this a traditional form or a traditional endpoint, we would have to pass the value directly to the function that we're calling. So if we in here had a function that was doBookmark, we might have to make an endpoint that receives the bookmark value ID and then sanitizes it, validates it against the database, and then does it. But with this, where we're just passing bookmark as a value, we can define the endpoint within the scope, within the closure of slug being passed. So this is magical because the way we define a component, just passing it a value, means we have access to that in our actions immediately. It's so cool. It's so cool. And since this is a server component, because it has to be, you can't call useServer in a client component. useServer can only be called in server files, means that this is safe. And it means that this has a really nice composable architecture where slug is a value that you got from your database being passed down through the component tree, and now it can be used. We'll do a demo with this near the end, not just yet though, because we have to talk a lot more about my example. Because honestly, I should have started here because my example's even simpler. This is meant to be a demo of like a feed on a web page. And on this feed, we're showing the posts that exist. And we're selecting the ones that have more than 100 likes. And then we map through all of them. This code also only runs on the server. I know that because it's an async component and there's no use client up top. The thing people seem to miss a lot is that you don't have to label server components. In fact, you can't. Server components aren't a thing that you put a marker on top of the same way with client, because those markers of useServer and useClient are meant to mark doors, not the behavior of a component. UseClient is for marking components as client side. useServer is for marking functions as actions that can be posted to. Different things. It sucks that they have names that are so 180 like that, where they feel like they're supposed to mirror each other, but they just straight up don't. But useServer, if you just think of that as useServer action, should be much easier to understand. Fuji made a good point, which is that you can use server only, and I probably should be showing that example more, but then people think you need that, which isn't helping either. But we'll go through that as we cover the security side of this, don't worry. So I'll just go to my code base to show the example. So I think this is awesome. One of the reasons people freak out about this, which I totally understand, is when they see it, they see a mess of separation of concerns going away. It's like, this should be in a service somewhere. This shouldn't be just part of your UI. Like if somebody writes a bad SQL query, all of a sudden you're going to tank your whole service. And those are fair things. Obviously, the first thing you should do is add in an ORM. I would use something like Drizzle ORM for this, but Prisma's honestly fine too. Any decent TypeScript ORM, or even something like Keasley that's just a query builder to quickly write more consistent queries, that's fine with me. But the more important piece we need to understand is how these concerns are, or in this case, aren't separated. The magic of server components is they don't force you in a specific architecture. We no longer have to have a backend with an API and a database and a front end that calls things with API calls and translates JSON. That separation worked great for a lot of things, but was unnecessary to be forced. This is the same reason stuff like HTMX is getting so much attention, because we've realized not every application is best served with every element coming either from the original HTML template or from the whole app being a shell and just making AJAX JSON requests. So why would we want this instead? Why would we just put our SQL in our components? Because this isn't meant to represent the right way to build. I'm not posting this because I think everyone should be writing SQL statements inside of their components, or even calls to their ORM directly inside their components. The reason I posted this is it perfectly showcases the flexibility of the new model. Those arbitrary barriers that we had before, the boundary between the backend and the front end, the database and the server, the components and the data that they were fetching, all of those boundaries were arbitrary. None of them had to be there. And that's why I'm really hyped about where we're at now, because we can take advantage of that. We can make our own boundaries. We can separate our own concerns. We can choose what does and doesn't need to be together. If you want to write SQL in your component, you can, but that's not what anyone's going to actually recommend. I posted a link to a blog post that I think everyone should read, and I'll be sure this is in the description as well, because this whole thing's worth a read. I already did a video about the React taint, which is what this largely goes in depth on. Check that out if you haven't. But the important piece here are how it shows you the different ways you can model your data. You can do what I showed there, but they only recommend that for prototypes and learning, as well as examples and what I was showcasing there. But the other patterns that they recommend are HTTP APIs and a data access layer. These are meant to be 3 different options for how you get data to your components in the new React model. This first one is what we're all used to, where we have existing HTTP APIs, be it they're hosted via GraphQL, they're written in Go or Python or Java or whatever the hell, and we're fetching data from those. You can still do that in the new model. You can just do a fetch call here, like fetch HTTPS api.someservice.com/posts. Like nothing stops me from doing something like this, but it's still better because I can dedupe these fetch calls on the server. I can pass all of the context and only take the parts I need and render those as HTML. It's still better to move a lot of those fetch calls to the server. So if you don't want to move entirely to the new model, you prefer having a standard API that exists outside of JavaScript and Next, that's fine. I honestly think this is a great option for a lot of people too. If you have a backend team that is already building a scalable service and you just want your front end to be better and to take advantage of these new patterns, just call fetch. It's fine. No shame there. You can even wrap these fetch calls in an SDK just by taking a bunch of them and dumping them in a single TypeScript file, write quick type definitions over it, and now you have access to that across your entire application. Super, super convenient. So I want to make sure we all understand that this is an option because I feel like when people see code like what I shared before, they assume you can't do this, but nothing's stopping you from doing this. You can adopt these things as much or as little as you want and split things accordingly. The way I tend to build things though is using the data access layer pattern. This pattern is super cool. It's effectively taking the things that your application code is using and writing them all in one place. So you have a folder named something like data or server or data layer. And in this folder, you write all of the functionality that you want to make sure can be used in your components. So instead of writing the SQL query here, what you might do is take this query, make a new folder. I'll make source data posts.ts. One other thing I'll do here to make sure it's clear that this is an option, import server only. This is a package that makes sure your code only runs on the server. So now if we try to import this code in a client component, it will immediately bomb because when you run something, or because when you call something with this import, it will error out if you try to use this on the client. So it's a small guarantee if you just want to be sure this only runs on the server. Not necessary. I would recommend it though, especially if you are using one of these hybrid code bases and you have concerns about server-side code leaking into the client. Overblown concern, this will solve it though. So now I'm going to take that function that I had before, well, this call that was there, export async function. Oh, look at that. SuperMaven's so smart. Ta-da. So we still need likes. So let's get those. Likes number. And we need SQL. So now we have that. Don't even really need to do the const rows check, but if you want to do any filtering or error cases, that's a good place to do it. Instead, we'll just immediately return that. Now that this function exists, we can just call that instead. So get posts, likes, got to import it. Ta-da, all done. Rows does not, oh, you have to await, sorry. One dumb, obvious mistake, cool. Once we've awaited that function, now we know we won't have this problem. There's a lot of different ways you could structure this too, depending on what you're looking for. Something I actually quite like and I've been doing more of is making a object that just has a lot of these functions on it, almost to feel like an SDK. So something like what I'm referring to would look like this, where I can have get posts as a function on here, export post DB API, hop in here, posts DB API.getPosts. You can obviously name this better. This is a quick hacky name. Point here is to showcase that you can have an abstraction like this that is being reused across your code base. You can wrap it using the cache functions to make sure it's being deduped on the server side so that if you call this in 3 places, it only gets called once. And here we see a bunch more examples. These functions can see username, can see phone number, all of this, all existing in a server-side file that can only be used on server that now you can import on client. We did see a good question, and it's really good because I screwed up in my most recent tutorial. People asking, where does TRPC fit in? I said in my video I would cover how TRPC fits here, and it was specifically referencing this stuff, and then I just forgot to in that tutorial. I wanted to fix that. So I want to do that quickly by going to the TRPC blog, using server actions with TRPC. The value of this blog post is specifically that it showcases the magic of TRPC inside of server components and this new architecture. So if we scroll down, I can find an example here. In this example, a server action procedure is defined using the new TRPC procedure stuff. And in here, we can do the experimental next after wrapper to create a server action procedure. So now that I have this created, I can use it to make new procedures. So that's still stubbing it out. Let's see an actual example. Cool. Create post. protected action dot input. So we still have the builder pattern to give it a validation. So this is for if you're doing use server stuff, like I made like a create post function. TRPC is really good for that because you can validate the input because the input is still coming from the client when you're making a use server action. So here we validate the input and we can do some logic here. And now we can call this either through a form or through just calling it in our client-side code, which is super, super easy to do. It's also protected from authenticated users due to the context that they added earlier. And now we can bind it in a form just like this. So this action expects a title. So now in the form, we have input type is text, and on submit, we have this extra stuff that we can do here in order to actually show anything we want to show. The usual submitting stuff with TRPC. I want to showcase the power of some of these patterns quick because I think they're magical. So let's do that. Tail ensure. You'll use TRPC. No auth, drizzle, app router, SQLite. Cool. Yeah. Oh, we just have one in here already. Nice. And yeah, we can just call that here. Dope. I think I just go with that then. Cool. What better example than your own, right? We're going to use the create T3 app template, which I just used with Drizzle, Tailwind, TRPC, and all the other options. Skipped auth. We don't need auth for this. You get the idea. So now I have a very simple example using SQLite locally with Drizzle. And if we go to api.post, I can command click this and we see the procedure here. Takes input, we validate that it's a string, and then we return hello, whatever that is. We also have DB calls here where we're able to get all of the latest posts as well as insert things as well. But I want to showcase how this actually works once we start playing with things together. So I'm going to delete almost all of this. Main and hello. That's going to be dot greeting. Cool. I'm going to delete this because we don't need it. And here we see hello from TRPC. Getting the message straight from our backend function. This all is just part of the create T3 app template. Again, the magic of this is that this command click works. Oh, so convenient. So the way that we're using TRPC here is it's effectively an abstraction between our backend and wherever we want to use the backend's data. So that could be a client calling it via a client component. That could be a server calling it as well. It's really nice to have one place to put all of these things because now you have one place to audit, code review, and go through things. Initially, I'm not going to do it this way though, and then I'll move to it so we can see the difference. First, I want to actually get posts data. So I will change this accordingly. We'll do posts equals await DB, which is our Drizzle database function. If you go to the schema, you can see the database schema as well, which just has ID, name, created at, and updated at for all of the posts. I could just call SQL directly, but I don't feel like setting that up here. So instead, we're going to use the Drizzle ORM with default stuff, db.query.posts.findMany. So now we have posts, which is an array with ID, name, created at, updated at, and we should be able to just render this. Posts.map post, that's fine with me. Should have a key though, in order to make React happy, post.id. Cool, so now all of the posts are going to be listed. But you'll see there's no such table because I haven't actually run any of the SQL stuff yet. Bun, run, db, push, cool. Now we have a db that should work, but has nothing in it. So we should add things. Bun, run, db, studio. Now we can go to local.drizzle.studio. Very quickly add some fake records. Name first post, second post. Cool. Now we have these two values. And if we go back to the actual dev environment, we'll see first post, second post. Super, super nice. I love this comment, Aiden. I'm sorry, but how the fuck is there SQL drama? How do we invent drama for something made in the 80s? Yeah. And how are people mad about a pattern that was established in the 80s that we're bringing back the best parts of? So now we have very simple await DB query posts find many. Let's say we want to do something with the posts, like delete them. Here's where the new model becomes actually magical. Async. Actually, we don't even need to be async. It could just be function post. And we'll take in post, which we don't actually have the typing for. There's a lot of ways to get this type. I trying to think of the best one to showcase here. Honestly, I'll show you the really simple, stupid one. We will just ask for the things we want, which are ID and name. We don't really care too much about the rest. And now we'll use this instead. Post equals post. And in here, we'll just return that. What's this mad about? Oh, it might be null. Ugh, I'm annoyed with that. It's just name that can be null, right? I could make the type stricter, but I don't care. That fixes it for now. The magic of server actions is when you can combine these things. Let's say we wanted the ability to delete these posts. That's where useServer comes in. We don't use useServer here because this code is already running on the server. We don't need to tell React or Next.js that. We can triple, quadruple check and confirm by doing import server only, which will be hey, by the way, make sure this never, ever, ever can run on the client. By default, it's not going to, because if you don't put use client or import this in a use client component, it will not run on the server. So when we use use server, it's not because this file needs to only run on the server. It's because we want to expose a function to the client. So if we hop down here and change this to add a delete button to it, let's make this class class name. Been writing too much svelte and solid recently. We'll do p4 flex gap 2. Cool. And now inside of here, I want to add a delete button. So I will make this a form, button type equals submit, and I'll just put an X there. So now we have the little X button for both of these. It doesn't do anything. You'll see it is posting though, because it's a form. So if you saw there, that little question mark, that's because it is loading data from the server when you do that. So if we want to do something with this, we want this to do something, we'll just make a quick action example. Action equals async function. I'll just do async arrow functions because it's easier. Oh, I did that wrong because I'm stupid. Cool. Async. And here's where you put use server. So I'll put use server here. If I console.log, deleting post, cool. We'll let Super even do its thing. Form action, use server, deleting post. Now when I click this button, nothing's happening. If I go to the console, also nothing's happening. But if I go here, you see deleting post because that code runs on the server. That's the magic, is we've created a little portal here where when you submit something by clicking this button, it is binding it to this function on the server. What's really cool though is if we look at the network tab, you'll see it's always posting to the same endpoint. All of these posts are just going to localhost 3000. Just all posting straight to localhost 3000, but there's two different buttons here. And when I click the different ones, it knows deleting post 1 or deleting post 2. How does it know that if it's just posting there? That's where the magic of these closures comes in, because React knows when you pass post and then you use it here, that it's being used for this action, it will actually silently embed it inside of the element. So in this form action, this form itself has these hidden inputs in it that tell React which of the functions it should run in and which variables it should have access to. They're all encrypted because they don't want users to have access to data here that they shouldn't have access to. But by doing this, they're now able to make sure each of these forms is bound to the right thing on the server side without having them bound to different functions, without having them pass different data manually. All of those things are just kind of handled for you, which is super, super convenient. And it means you can write a component that's this simple where I just pass it a post and then you use it in the action and it works. If I want to add deleting here, super easy. await db.delete. I don't think we have the ability yet in Drizzle to autocomplete on anything but queries. So I think I have to pass this the table type. So I'll import posts dot where ID is post ID. Oh, I think I have to do where EQ. I have to import EQ as well. Yep. So this is effectively saying we're going to delete from the posts table where posts.id is the same as post.id. This pattern is super convenient because it's just an equality check. This is a SQL call. I could have wrote the SQL, but it won't be type safe. So I'm just using this to autocomplete. And now when I click, nothing's happening. I refresh, it's gone. But I don't want to have to refresh. I want it to just go away. Let me quickly re-add this so that we still have posts to test with. And now I want to make it so it refreshes. Easiest way to do that is revalidate. You can revalidate path or tag. I think path makes the most sense here because we just want this path to be updated. And by saying revalidate path / we're now saying to React and specifically Next.js, when this action is completed, regenerate this page and send the changes to the user. So by putting this here, now when I go to the page and I click delete, it sends the updated page as the response to that post. If you go to the network tab again, you'll see when I delete, it only sends this one post request. And the payload is what it needs to change in the response on the page. No data found with yada yada. Cool. It's not actually showing me the stuff because this is annoying, but it sends you the update that you need to actually update the page. So you don't have to make a second request just to get the updated content. Super, super nice pattern. But as I'm sure a lot of people are already feeling when they see this, all this server code mixed in your markup, that's so bad. Separation of concerns, yada yada. Cool. Let's separate our concerns a bit then. I will not even do it using tRPC initially. We will make a folder that is data layer. And here I'm going to make just index.ts. Cool. We'll make an object that represents all of this. Export const data layer. I'll even call this DL just to give it a nice little shorthand. And this will have, we'll call them queries and we'll say mutations. So let's actually build them now. We want one for getting posts. Let's do that. Get posts. Need to get DB imported here. Cool. And this file is important enough that I would actually take the time to import server only to be 100% sure here. So now we have the get post function. Now let's do the delete post function. Delete post async ID number. And I need to switch that to this. Import posts. and EQ. Cool. And now we have our data layer and it has queries and mutations. So let's call that. Go back here, post equals await DL import dot query dot get posts. Get rid of all those. We don't need them anymore. And now I'll do the same down here. Await DL dot mutation dot delete post. And there we go. Our concerns are now separated. We now have a data layer, an abstraction between these things. And people are already making jokes in chat. Can I rename the DL to GQL? Not the worst idea. But yeah, you get the point. The goal here is to make it so there's a clean abstraction, a point of reference, a place where all of these things live, which is my data layer file. And now that this is the place where we have all of the things that interface with our database, we have a clean abstraction that's a lot easier to code review, put lint rules on, and make sure never leaks into the client. It's still very fun to just call your database inside of a component and use that to get data to prototype things. But as soon as you want to do things more serious, abstracting it into a layer like this makes a lot of sense. Those who have already written tRPC might be feeling some right now because that might feel familiar. It's effectively the same thing we do with tRPC, where you create a tRPC router and you pass it procedures where we're defining functions. The difference is they have inputs, they're validated, and they have a concept of queries and mutations that is baked in. So we call .query to make a thing that's just for fetching data. We call .mutation for a thing that makes changes to data. And this pattern works great. In the same way to DL.query.getPosts, I could await the tRPC API, which we just call API in these projects, .posts.getLatest. And it works the same way. This is just one post, but if I command click, because again, tRPC is magic, you can just command click there, which obviously does also work with the simple example I was doing here. We can get straight to the place the thing came from. With tRPC, if I want get posts, public procedure, cool. Just auto-completed the whole thing. Don't even need the context other than as a way to access the DB. Now we have that instead. I go back here, change this to get posts. And now the code is exactly the same. I'll prove it by adding 2 more, 4th, 5th. Hop back here. And now we have these being fetched the same way, but using tRPC instead. So while playing with these examples, I just used a inline SQL equivalent. I used a data abstraction layer that's literally just an object with functions on it. And I used a full-on API layer abstraction that could be consumed by other things using something like tRPC. And you can mix and match all of those in the same components, because that's the magic of the new pattern. React isn't telling you how to separate these things anymore. And that is great. I was playing with Rails a few days ago, and when I was playing with it again, because I wanted to do a demo with it, because I used to be a big Rails user, the number of different files you have to touch just to get new data into your UI is insane. It's actually insane. And with patterns like this, those problems just go away. You just don't think about those things. You abstract as much or as little as your problem needs. The same way React components meant that we no longer had to break everything into model view controller if it didn't make sense. The co-location of concerns where you think makes sense is the magic of this. If you think having SQL inside of your components is the right way, cool, do it. If you think having an object that has all of your functions in one place makes sense, awesome, do that. If you really like having a formal abstraction of something like tRPC where there's validation on every single input, there are contexts being shared across all of this, awesome, do that. And if you have an old API that you want to keep using that you're just not wanting to drop for any of many totally valid reasons, then we go back up here, HTTP APIs, totally a valid option too. You can do any and all of these. You can mix and match the parts. It's composable, it's unique, and it's awesome. I hope this helps clarify why I don't think these patterns are scary and what the future of this stuff looks like. The goal was never to write SQL in components. The goal was always to make our solutions composable so that we can solve problems how we want to in the ways that make the most sense for our applications. What do you guys think though? Because I know this was a chaotic one. Until next time, peace. Okay, one more meme I had to sneak in. This was hilarious. Tom does text, also a tech YouTuber. Check out his stuff. He does the tutorials. I probably should be, but this is fantastic. If everybody's so mad about putting SQL in our HTML, why don't we just put HTML in our SQL? So here we're concatenating values that we're selecting to elements in HTML so that we can render all of this as a response from our SQL database. Beautiful, wonderful. No notes. Oh, actually one note, XSX. Who's that? SQL side rendering, SSR. Oh, so much gold. Why run server close to DB if you can run it in DB? This is so good. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom.